things on what people have said. I mean, firstly, the destabilisation point, I think, obviously because time is so limited, it was a shame, but what happened in Chile obviously was a coup, but before the coup came the economic destabilisation, and that's what happens in countries. First they'll attack your economy. I mean, Nixon famously said, let the economy scream. And there were things like the bosses going on strike. I mean, I was saying, can you imagine that as workers? Your boss goes on strike. How bizarre. The bosses went on strike. The supermarkets were emptied of food. Now, this is during Allende's time, so obviously you go to the shops and there's nothing there. Who are you going to look at to blame? Your government. That's why it's amazing that actually Allende's majority went up during that time, despite all this. And so the CIA implemented the second track of the plan, which was the coup. But Venezuela is the same thing that happened there not long ago. And it's the same thing that Alvaro from the embassy was telling me tonight is happening there again now. They're taking the things out of the supermarkets. So deep destabilisation obviously can come in militarised form, but it can also come in a way of cutting loans, you know, destabilising your economy. The Falklands, I just want to make the point, yeah, Thatcher did help. Pinochet did help Thatcher. The thing that does get lost, I think, in the discourse around Falklands, and especially in Britain, I think, is the fact that actually Argentina had a dictatorship at the time, just as brutal as Pinochet, more in the sense that more people died because Argentina's a bigger country. And the poor soldiers that went there to fight for Argentina were conscripts, many of which didn't want to be there, didn't believe in that fight, and least of all didn't believe in the motherland because they had a dictator who was probably the same person who's making their parents disappear. So people often forget and think that, you know, these Argentinian soldiers went there with the same kind of ferocity that the British ones did, but it wasn't like that, and it was a very tragic war. For both sides, but I think Argentinians particularly, you know, really paid the price for that. And just lastly, I leave the deep state and the arms trade to Jeremy, but I just wanted, how do you achieve socialism is a big question. We could have that all night, couldn't we? But I think one of the things that, and obviously no government is perfect, and we keep mentioning Allende's kind of minority vote. If we look at Tony Blair, if you look at the figures in which Tony Blair won in 2005, he actually won with about 22% of the vote. If you look at the vote percentage according to how many people voted, only 22% of the population voted for him. So let's keep that into perspective. To me, it doesn't matter whether he came in a minority, because actually all presidents come in minorities. The United States is even worse. But he certainly had the popular mandate. And I won't even mention the coalition government's legitimacy, electoral legitimacy. But I think one of the things that certainly we can learn from Chile is the unity of the left. Being a left-wing activist myself, it sometimes can be demoralising the amount of factions and arguments we have amongst our own in the left. Because I tell you what, apart from UKIP, you never see the right wingers doing it. And we're too busy arguing with ourselves about the finest detail of Marx and Lenin to actually start really fighting the real battle. And there's a real need in Britain to unite the left and link with social movements. And link with social movements. Where was the linking with the students in the fight against the tuition fee? Where was the link with the Occupy movement? Where's the, there's a real need to go back to grassroots. Very much like trades councils used to in the times when I arrived in this country. Go back and link the organised left with the mass movements on the grassroots. And that's when you're going to get your true path to socialism.
The destabilisation strategy was started, well, it almost started before the election, because there were supporters of popular unity that were shot during the election campaign by neo-fascist groups, and there was always a very nasty far-right fascist element within Chilean politics that was used to physically attack leaders of trade unions, local communities and things like that. It was always there. And the election campaign in 1970 was far from plain sailing in any kind of way. There was all kinds of personal abuse and attacks thrown at Allende, but also there was physical attacks made on his organisers and supporters of the campaign. So the result was incredible and amazing, and I agree with you. He got that percentage on a very high turnout in the election. He was endorsed as president absolutely by the Congress, and the support for all of the popular unity parties went up during the period, even though it was an incredibly broad coalition going from the sort of the Christian left of the Christian Democrats through to the movement of the revolutionary left through the Mir. It was a massive spread of people, and there were many who didn't believe there was any kind of parliamentary road anyway, and that there was then the question of arming workers and supplying arms and so on. So there was always that debate going on. And your point is absolutely right, that at the same time there was a huge growth of community and the sense of community of people which had been built, which is what popular unity had been built on, and was growing, and all the housing projects and everything else. But remember, he was actually in office for 3 years. He was in office for a shorter time than President Kennedy, actually. It was less than 1,000 days. And so much was achieved, and so much iconography stems from that. But it's quite easy to destabilise a radical government. I don't know if any of you remember, in the late 70s, I think 76 onwards, the People's National Party won the election in Jamaica. Michael Manley became Prime Minister, who was far more radical than his father, the late Norman Manley. And remember, I lived in Jamaica before that and sort of knew a bit about the place. And the PNP government pursued a series of radical social policies and economic policies. And they were then told by their creditors, because Jamaica inherited debts on independence and debts have built up ever since, that they had to seek an IMF loan, just like the British Labour government did in 77. They had to seek an IMF loan, and they had to cut back on social spending, cut back on housing programs, increase unemployment, all the kind of garbage that you hear now, which has been said in Chile, not in Chile, in Greece and Spain and so on. And the PNP executive said, no, we're not doing that. We are not seeking a loan. We are going to restructure our economy in a way that benefits the people of Jamaica. What happened? Within 2 days, there were food shortages. Supermarkets were empty. There was a crisis created with incredible speed, which destroyed the government of Michael Manley. It was a government that cannot provide day-to-day essentials and food for its people soon suffers, whatever the reasons they suffer. And I think in Chile it was amazing that the government gained support, which shows a high degree of political understanding. Manley's government lost office, and we then had a very pro-American government that very happily accepted the IMF loans and all that went with it. So remember that. The other point I was making about deep state, I don't want to be paranoid about this, but in the case of Chile, as now in the case of Egypt and other places, there is a highly organised, very effective, very arrogant agglomeration of people around the military. They're trained, they're efficient, they're organised, they're in communication, and they have a set of objectives. And if they don't like a government, they will weaken and remove that government. The military and the plotters in Chile were soon hooked in to the CIA, and remember that many of them had been trained at West Point and other places in the USA. So there was a whole link between US military training and the leadership, particularly of the Army and the Air Force, less so of the Navy in Chile. But there were also divisions. Michel Bachelet's father was totally opposed to the coup. Carlos Prats was totally opposed to the coup. There were some generals who remained loyal to the constitution and loyal to the government. They said, no, we live in a democracy. Allende was elected. It's our duty to protect the government, not to change it. But that deep state brought about facilitated the arrangements of the coup. Good question on the arms trade. We've had the arms services exhibition this week in Docklands, and we are a very big exporter of arms around the world, and we export loads of arms, £2 billion contracts to Saudi Arabia, Qatar, United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, and if we export arms of any sort to any government, to any place, and they're used against the people of that country or against protesting about human rights abuses. We had a debate, I said, on Thursday afternoon in Parliament. Before it, I went out for a demonstration in Parliament Square, quite a small demonstration, of campaign against the arms trade. And I met a young man there who had, Bahraini, young guy, in his early 20s, I would say, and he took his shirt off and showed me his body, peppered with grape shot wounds all over his body, and gunshot wounds. And I asked him what happened. He'd been on a demonstration in the square in Bahrain against the royal family and the military and against the Saudi occupation of Bahrain for democracy, and he was attacked by the police and by the army and injured and came here. Who supplied the riot control equipment? Who supplied the CS gas? Who supplied the guns? Who supplied the armored cars? Who supplied the planes? And crucially, who supplied all the surveillance equipment that was used against them? Every single one of them, British manufacturers. So does that give us any credibility whatsoever in protesting to the Bahrain government, saying, you shouldn't do these kind of things, they're very naughty. And so I kind of put that point to a rather quizzical meeting in the House of members of Parliament who sort of were quite embarrassed by this. But then I followed it up by saying, look, yes, of course I'm against this export of arms, I'm against the arms industry. I'm not against people that work in the arms industry. I want that brilliance, that ability, that technical know-how to be used for other things. You don't have to make warplanes, you don't have to make nuclear weapons, you don't have to make nuclear submarines. You can make better railways, you can make green energy equipment, you can make high-tech medical equipment. We have amazing abilities in this country for high technology of all sorts. Our economy is diminished by the reliance on the arms trade, not strengthened by it. And I think we should say thank you to those people that protested at the Armed Services export place this week. And on the Bolton's War, just finishing this point, the best way it was ever summed up for me was that lovely book that came out at the time, which was The Iron Lady versus the Tin Pot General. They both needed the war. They both needed the war because Thatcher was in trouble, Galtieri was in trouble. He was just as brutal as Pinochet or anybody else, and Thatcher was just as brutal as them, but in a different way. I remember Orgreave and the miners' strike and all that. We know exactly what she was about. I wish there had been a fly on the wall on the chat between Pinochet and Thatcher when they were at Virginia Water. But we were all outside singing El Pueblo Unido again, so I haven't seen it.